The government has released details of the new legislation which will replace the Resource Management Act. I'm joined by ACT leader David Seymour. So we're going to get the Natural and Built Environments Bill and the Spatial Planning Bill now introduced to Parliament. But I don't think you're not too happy with what's replacing the RMA, are you?
Well, that's right. I mean, there's some fundamental problems with the Resource Management Act. And if I was to sum it up, there is too much confusion over who has the right to do what with property. Too many people can object on too many grounds, and there are far too many objectives in the RMA that councils have to trade off when they're making plans. And the net result is there's just a lot of uncertainty, a lot of delay about getting stuff done.
But isn't these two bills kind of shrinking that down and making it a bit clearer?
Well, that's certainly what they say on the tin. And they say, well, because there will be, now 15 plans made by larger regional planning authorities instead of, 67 TLAs and then various sub-entities and overarching district councils or regional councils, then, there'll be fewer plans made. And that's certainly true. But the problem was never that there are too many councils making too many plans. The problem is the content of those plans. And in that respect, very little changes. If you look at what the critical sections are, the purpose of the Act and the system outcomes, what you see is that there are 18 different sections or outcomes under system outcomes. All of those are going to have to be traded off by councils or whoever makes these plans.
And if I'm right, the bill doesn't rank them in any sense of importance, does it?
That's right. So if the difference really between this and the RMA is that this is new and it's going to take time for the courts and the councils to work out what it all means legally. And in the time it's going to take to interpret the new terms, nothing will get done.
Well, how important will it be then? Because under the Natural and Built Environment Bill is going to be this national planning framework, and the idea there, I think, is that you have a uniform set of rules that apply across the board, and presumably give some more guidance to how councils look at those outcomes.
Yeah, but again, I mean, it really is a change of the administrative structure rather than a change of the principles that underpin the bill. So you still have all of these system outcomes, you still have this purpose that involves 4 different purposes to be traded off. So there's still this basic assumption that what you can do with your property depends on how some other entity interprets these vague and conflicted set of objectives. Yes, and then they say, but we're going to change the administrative structure so there'll be fewer plans and fewer organisations, and then we'll tell them that they have to do certain things faster in a certain way and simpler. But the truth is that has existed throughout the history of the Resource Management Act. So the national policy statements have always been there and have been used, not as much as they should have been, but were able to be. And it's not clear that national policy statements actually make anything better anyway. So, they can argue that they've got different guidance coming from central government, that they've got a different wiring diagram of administrators, but at the end of the day, what you can do on your property depends on these overarching and conflicted objectives, which have to be interpreted by someone else before you know what you can do.
But those bills, though, do restrict the number of kind of people who could object about what you're doing on your property, don't they? I mean, I think under the RMA, pretty much anyone who didn't like what you were doing, whether they lived next door or 3 streets away, could object. But I think that's going to change, isn't it, under the bill?
Well, bear in mind that the RMA was 900 pages, this is 860, so the idea that it's got simpler is probably not true, but also, there's a lot to analyse here. But I think the only thing I can think of that I've come across so far that you could be referring to is that amenity is no longer a purpose of objection. So you can't stop people from doing something because you won't like the look of the neighbourhood if they do it. And that I do think is a reasonable change. I think if you like the look of your neighbourhood, then good on you, but you shouldn't be able to restrict and freeze it in time forever and a day. Understand all of that. But ultimately, that's the only concession I'm aware of that really changes the basic question of how many people have a say of what happens on your land according to how many conflicted objectives. So long as we have that basic problem, we are going to end up with a lot of delay, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of stuff not getting built.
Well, the government says this is going to cut out, it's going to make it quicker and less costly. I think it's estimating conservatively it'll cut costs by 19%, save $149 million a year in terms of the cost of consenting. You don't think that's going to be the case?
No, well, of course they have to say that. They're hardly going to say they're introducing a bill that will make everything more expensive and take longer. But once you look under the hood, there's no reason to believe they're correct. In ACT's view, what we need to do is move the whole underlying assumption and principle of resource management away from central planning towards property rights and say the objective of this Act is to preserve the enjoyment of property. You can do what you like enjoying your property so long as your actions don't harm the enjoyment of others' property or commonly held property such as rivers and lakes and air quality. If you started from that point of view and said you've got a right to do what you like so long as no one else can demonstrate direct effects on their property and so long as you don't harm any commonly held property such as, say, the Waikato River Authority or the Hauraki Gulf Forum would be examples of representatives of collective property, then you can do what you like. And that's very different from the assumption that you can do anything that is consistent with all of these system outcomes.
But isn't there the change they have made though is does the focus on outcomes rather than effects that doesn't make a difference to planning, the planning process?
Well, again, we started off with rules-based, then we moved to effects-based. Now we've got outcomes-based. And it's not clear how this is actually going to improve things because the problem with effects-based was that the effects had to be calculated. Now, I can see the benefit of outcomes that you might, for example, say that you can start mining coal at Huntly again because the outcome of importing it from Indonesia was actually worse than any effects of mining coal in Huntly. However, that is still vulnerable to the difficulty that you need, first of all, to have somebody else assess what the effects or outcomes are. So in that sense, it's the same versus a rules-based system, which at least you knew if you were on the right side of the line or not. You didn't have all of this calculation cost and uncertainty in the meantime. So I think whether it's outcomes or effects, the difficulty is measuring it and disputing it. That causes a problem.
Now, this is going to go to Select Committee, 6-month process. Government intends to have it in law by the time of the next election. Is that a long enough time to consider the bills? And given that there was an exposure bill put...
Yeah, there was. And give David Parker some credit. He has worked hard on this. But at the end of the day, he got Tony Randerson. I mean, he got the guy that was one of the architects of the Resource Management Act to write the report on which he based his reforms. And unsurprisingly, you've got a piece of legislation that, in its fundamental principle, is no different from the one that it replaced. It's just administered differently. I think that ultimately they're going to rush it through Parliament. This Labour government is preparing to lose, and that they're doing that by getting as much through as possible. But I think ACT and National, even just from the discussions we've had today, will be looking to put in place proper RMA reform that returns this legislation of resource management back to a law that is focused on the enjoyment of property and real demonstrable impacts on other people's property and the commons, rather than trying to trade off 18 different system outcomes.
So you'll vote against it?
Caucus has to decide that, but I think it would be likely that ACT would vote against this, yes.
David Seymour, thank you for your time.
Thank you.